And I remember I was 16 years old at the time, Richard, and I remember reading it, reading the newspaper and seeing his picture in there, and saying to myself, wow, that thing really does look like a face. Now, of course, one of the little spots here, like on the nose, that's not really a nostril, although we'll talk about nostrils a little later. It's a data error. But this is what got the whole thing started. NASA's explanation at the time was given by a guy named Gerald Soffen, who's no longer with us, who was one of the primary mission scientists on the Viking mission. And he told the assembled press, including, I think, Richard, you were there, right?
Yeah.
Yes. He said this, quote, "Isn't it peculiar what tricks of light and shadow can do? When we took another picture a few hours later, it all went away. It was just a trick, just the way the light fell on it." Well, there's a problem with that explanation in that Mars is rotating, just like the Earth, about 24 hours. I think it's 24.9 hours is the rotational period for a day on Mars. And Viking is orbiting probably every 90 minutes or so in a polar orbit around Mars, taking pictures. Well, obviously, if Mars continues to rotate and Viking continues to orbit at a higher speed, they're not going to be anywhere near Cydonia, the region where the picture was taken. And besides that, it turned out later it would have been dark. So there would be no second disconfirming picture of the face on Mars. And I remember, again, that newspaper account in the Seattle Times reading it and saying, well, gosh, if there's another picture that proves it's not a face, how come they don't show us that one? Well, as a matter of fact, it took them 17 years, but they finally admitted that there was no such picture. There was no disconfirming picture. This was really the first thing that became a first chink in the armor of NASA, where I think some people with open minds begin to seriously question whether or not they were being told the truth by NASA. And it took a while for it to filter through that this was BS, but as a matter of fact, this may have been the point where it all started, where some people begin to say, maybe these guys really aren't telling us everything. Fortunately, we had a couple of intrepid imaging contractors named Vince DiPietro and Greg Molinar who went through and tried to find that disconfirming image, and they were the ones who confirmed that there was no disconfirming image. But what they did find was a second image of the face, 7813. Curiously, it was misfiled. They went through the records and they said, okay, they should have passed over Cydonia again at about the right altitude, about the right lighting conditions to get another picture. And when they went to look for it, it wasn't there. So literally they had to thumb through, and these are actual, I guess, photographic plates or negative prints, and look and look and look and look until they finally found 7813 on the right, which is at a little bit higher sun angle. You can see a little bit more detail on the right. And these are enhancements actually done later in the mid-'80s by Dr. Mark Carlotto, who got a lot more out of the original data, as you can see, than was in that very first processed image by NASA. The most interesting thing to me, and this will come up a little bit later, was the teeth. There's this argument that there were teeth in the mouth, and if you look at both these frames, it sure looks that way. The argument has been that these are data processing artifacts. That is a really hard explanation to buy because of the fact that in one image, I think the face was, in 35A72, it was sort of face up, and the other one it was upside down. And so how could you get the same processing artifacts, or if it was all based on grids and so forth, when you had completely different perspectives from which the pictures were taken? So from that point, they began to pull other people together into the investigation. Richard got suckered into it, and that's a story he tells in Monuments, which is really, I think, interesting to read. And they found some other objects around the face that appeared to be, at least potentially, artificial. Among them, of course, the cluster of pyramidal mountains called the City. The fortress was included in that. The D&M pyramid, which is this massive pentagonal pyramid. The Tholis, a rounded mound, kind of similar to stuff that you'd see in some parts of England. The cliff, an incredibly straight-lined sort of ridge that appeared to be built on the ejecta blanket of a crater, and indeed a little weird little tetrahedral kind of pyramid mound thing right on the rim of that crater. There were also these little mounds spaced everywhere, which, although they're tiny in this image, are in fact about the size of the Great Pyramid. So you're talking about the scale of the face, the scale of the D&M is incredible. You can't even really, I don't think, see these mounds very well in this picture. That's how big the face and some of the other objects are. So from there, the focus kind of went on to the D&M pyramid, and the argument was back in the days that this was a four-sided object or a five-sided object. Eventually, the enhancements sort of showed that it had 5 pretty specific corner spots. There was some blast damage and an exit wound here that may or may not have been caused by something exploding from inside this or being shot in from the outside. It was really hard to tell. But there was some distortion. However, it did seem that the original shape was probably pentagonal. Eventually, a guy named Errol Torin, who worked for the Defense Mapping Agency, I think it's now called NEMA, whose job was to look at images, satellite images, and determine what was artificial and what was natural in those images. In other words, what was camouflage for the guys in the Defense Department, so they could do things like pick targets for air sorties for the Gulf War and so forth. He took a look at this, and he initially thought that he was going to be, it was going to be a false positive, but what he wrote, Richard, at the time was, I have a good background in geomorphology, which is how things are formed, and I don't know of any mechanism to explain the formation of this particular object. When he applied some other rules to it, he eventually determined that it was what they termed, Richard and Errol Torin termed, the Rosetta Stone of Cydonia, because it's the key thing about a tetrahedron is if you circumscribe it with a sphere, the little points, the corners of it, will touch at a specific latitude, 19.5 degrees or 19.47 to be precise, north or south, depending on the orientation of the tetrahedron. So that said something to them that, hey, the message seems to be something about tetrahedrons. Well, what could that possibly mean? Here is basically a tetrahedron. It's got, each face has 3 edges, 3 lines, and it's got a very simple structure. In fact, it's the base structure that's used when a 3D artists are creating figures for video games and so forth. They use triangles, they use tetrahedrons to create them. So the observations were made that, gosh, if you look around the solar system, here on Earth there's the volcano Mauna Kea, I think it is, in Hawaii. On Jupiter you have the Great Red Spot. There were these disturbances or upwellings of energy at this 19.5 degree latitude, and it was repeated on Mars, where you had Olympus Mons, the biggest shield volcano in the solar system, and one tetrahedral vertex over from that, in other words 120 degrees, and then north a little bit was Cydonia itself, the face on Mars. So that was kind of interesting. The same thing happened with Neptune. When Voyager got to the outer solar system and imaged Neptune for the first time, there was this massive, massive storm, real similar to Jupiter's Great Red Spot, which is called the Great Dark Spot. And it waxes and wanes, it's come and gone. I don't know if it's currently back on Neptune or not, but it has waxed and waned a few times. And it too is centered around or very near this 19.5 degree latitude. So at that point, they felt like they were onto something. And it turned out that in the past, there was some interest in tetrahedral geometry and circumscribed tetrahedral geometry by some of the basic pioneers, really, of modern physics, guys like James Clerk Maxwell, about whom Albert Einstein said that his work was the most profound and fruitful since Newton. So this was this got them thinking that perhaps there had been a lost physics or a lost concept in physics that had led to explain why you would have these energy upwellings at this 19.5 degree latitude. Now, the theory eventually became known as hyperdimensional physics because Richard surmised that you were getting energy from these higher dimensions, again, based on the original work of Maxwell. The problem with the original work of Maxwell is that this guy, Oliver Heaviside, got a hold of it after Maxwell passed away. Now, he hated the parts of Maxwell's work